If you've watched our previous videos, you'll recall that we identified the gradual shift in the ELCA from a governance and mission anchored in the life of local congregations to one of a more corporate mindset. Additionally, we pointed to the next ELCA Churchwide Assembly as a place where we might see that shift continuing. In the next series of videos, we'll provide an update on what the ELCA has placed on its Churchwide Assembly agenda to date and the likely ramifications of the votes at that assembly. The ELCA Church Council is the governing body overseeing the denomination's work. They met on November 14th to 17th, 2024. One of the critically important things that this group does is to assess and approve proposed constitutional amendments that will be sent on to the Churchwide Assembly. In other words, this group determines what specific constitutional amendments will be voted on and then implemented at the next Churchwide Assembly. That next assembly meets in Phoenix beginning July 28, 2025. 3 sets of documents from the November Church Council meeting inform what we're going to talk about in these videos. First, there are the minutes from the meeting, which report on the actions taken by the council. The second set of documents, and the more informative, is the supporting exhibits, some 380 pages. A third document is a memorandum from the ELCA Secretary dated January 27, 2025, that provides the rationale for the proposed amendments. We've provided links to those documents so that you can dig into them for yourself. But for this video, we're going to unpack one of the proposed constitutional amendments that got passed by the Church Council, and so will be voted on at the Assembly. One of the most significant votes the Council took was to approve a proposed change to how the ELCA amends its own Constitution. Some people think that the current process to amend the Constitution is cumbersome. They want this changed so as to be more streamlined and not take as long. Today, a change to the Constitution can happen in 2 different ways. The first involves the Church Council. Here's how that works. An amendment is proposed to the Church Council, which, after approving that proposal, sends it to the synods at least 6 months prior to the Churchwide Assembly. If, at the Churchwide Assembly, the amendment is approved by 2/3 of the delegates, that change goes into effect immediately. Keep that in mind as we'll make reference to that point in a little while. The second way the Constitution can be changed is by a proposed amendment brought at the National Assembly by a minimum of 25 voting members, so-called floor amendments. After being reviewed by a committee to ensure it's a valid amendment, the Assembly can vote on it. If it passes by 2/3, then it will go into effect if and only if the next Churchwide Assembly also approves it by 2/3 3 years later. This particular process is what some consider too slow and too cumbersome. Now here's what happened at the November Council meeting in an attempt to address this issue. Rather than having to wait for the next Churchwide Assembly, the proposed amendment gives the Church Council the authority to ratify floor amendments anytime within a year of the first vote by the Churchwide Assembly. Not surprising, perhaps, that the Church Council voted to approve a proposed amendment that would give the Church Council more authority. And let's be blunt, this also reduces congregational input on these amendments, and thus, congregational authority. To explain the ramifications of this change, let's go back to our illustration of apples and oranges from our 3rd video. If an Assembly floor amendment was passed saying that the ELCA decided to change the Constitution so that their mission was selling oranges instead of apples, congregations currently have 3 years to decide whether or not they agree with that idea and try to influence the vote at the next Churchwide Assembly. This proposed change eliminates that timeline. If this amendment passes in July, then at that very assembly, an amendment that directly impacts congregations and pastors can be proposed. And when passed by 2/3 of the delegates, it would simply need to be approved by 2/3 of the Church Council in the upcoming days. Then voila! Congregations are all about oranges. No longer would they have the opportunity to review the change and influence the outcome. To be clear, we're not speculating or fear-mongering here. In a memorandum dated January 27, 2025, the ELCA Secretary provided the ELCA's rationale for the proposed constitutional amendments. Her explanation of the change to the floor amendment process puts it this way. Quote, "The changes would allow amendments introduced on the floor of the Churchwide Assembly to be ratified unchanged by a 2/3 vote of the Church Council within 12 months of the Assembly, instead of waiting 3 years for the next Churchwide Assembly. Before we conclude this video, we need to recall what we talked about in an earlier video titled, What's Next? Specifically, what the co-chair of the Commission for the Renewed Lutheran Church said in regard to the urgency for change. And this is how he put it, quote, "It's a different environment. You can't take 6 years to make changes anymore in this world," end quote. With this proposed constitutional amendment, that problem will certainly be solved. The ELCA will be able to make major changes to the Constitution and ethos of the denomination without having to seek the review or approval of voices from congregations. In fact, the need to even hold a reconstituting convention may be eliminated. Now, to be fair, votes will not be cast on these proposals until late July. And we're not saying that this will happen, but we are saying it's likely to happen. To help you understand what's been happening and why we keep using the language of likelihood of what's going to happen, we can use the analogy of a train. Think of the ELCA Churchwide organization as the engine on the train tracks. The train is on a track that is moving away from congregational autonomy and control. So far, there's no sign that this train is going to stop or switch directions. Watch the next videos to learn about additional indications that the ELCA train is continuing to move down that track, away from congregations.